Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, February 24th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you.
Before getting started, I just want to apologize to everybody who's watching us. I'm in real traveling. That's why I'm not in my studio. You may notice that. And Colonel, let's get started with what's going on right now between United States and Ukraine. What does the United States want from Ukraine in order to help them to achieve some sort of settlement for the situation that we're witnessing in Ukraine?
Well, at this stage, I think the Americans, first of all, they want this conflict to stop. They want the US to be no longer being involved in this conflict, and therefore they want it to stop, period. They want to focus on the main objective of the Trump policy or doctrine, we could say, which is making America great again, and which requires, in a first priority, the trade war, or having some, let's say, dealing with the main enemy they see today, or main adversary they see today, which is China. And in order to be able to allocate all the resources in that direction, they have to abandon all other conflicts, all other sources of inefficient or, let's say, resources that don't need to be spent that way. The Ukrainian conflict is one of these. Obviously, I think to some extent we can understand the perception of the conflict in the same way Elon Musk tries to sanitize the U.S. administration to some extent, meaning all the position that you fund without any success, without objective, without real strategy, without any return on investment, you just abandon that. And I see here some kind of continuity with the conflict in Ukraine, which is obviously other implications for both Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the world at large. So that's clear. But in essence, this is the same philosophy. We don't want to spend money on things where we don't see any return on investment, period. And in that, with that idea, the Trump administration wants to force Ukraine into a negotiation process. I think that's the idea. And that's why it wants to cut any support. And that's the reason why they also, when they had this meeting last week in Riyadh between the delegation, the Russian and the American delegation, the idea was that, they decided three things. First of all, to resume normal, let's say, diplomatic relationship between the two countries, to establish working groups on both sides, the Russian and American sides, to discuss the negotiation process. And third, and that explains also a part of the idea of Trump, is to have the Ukrainian elections or presidential elections as part of the peace process. And so that's the idea of Trump. It's to force Ukraine into a peace process, period. And the problem is that Ukraine is not ready for that. Obviously, Zelensky, for many reasons that probably have some domestic reasons. I'm not sure that if he engaged into negotiations with Russia, that his ultra-nationalist supporters would accept that. And on many occasions, people have said, including what he has been threatened with in May 2019 by Dmitry Yarosh, He was said, if you negotiate with Russia, I will kill you. So that was very clear. And they didn't use, Dmitry Yarosh didn't use the word kill, but he said, we will hang you on the highest tree of, I don't remember the name of the avenue in Kiev. So, and that was in the press, that was in the media, that was totally openly said. And we see that Zelensky has some pressure from these groups. And in addition to that, of course, the more we go into the conflict, the more his situation becomes uncomfortable, because obviously, if he had accepted or done what he wanted to do in March 2022, the situation of Ukraine would be much better than it is today and what it will be. Therefore, we see that every passing day shows a deterioration of the situation of Ukraine, not just the Ukrainian army, but the country at large. Therefore, he feels he's a little bit in this this syndrome of sunk cost, if you want, the sunk cost syndrome, meaning that you have invested so much into the conflict that you don't want to stop, because that would mean that your investment was not right. And there is this kind of syndrome as well, and that's probably the reason why he's so reluctant to discuss. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect, which is probably more important for the Russians and the Americans, is that since Volodymyr Zelensky is no longer president, because his term is finished since May 2014, it needs to have a presidential election, which is currently not possible because of the martial law. And in theory, the head of the Ukrainian state at this stage should be the head of the president of the Ukrainian parliament, which is the Verkhovna Rada. And so it is, but obviously we see that it's not the president of the parliament which is in charge, but Zelensky has retained the powers. The problem is that not only he issued, before the end of the term of his presidency, a decree prohibiting any type of negotiation with Russia as long as Putin is in power. Today, he's not only he's no longer president, but he has not even the power to abrogate the decree he issued as he was president, because he's no longer entitled to take that decision. And besides this legal aspect, there is also a concern for the Russians, because what happened, or what would happen, if you have a negotiation, an agreement on some kind of peace, if the person which is in front of you is not habilitated to sign this agreement? So who validates the document on the Ukrainian side? And therefore, there is here both a legitimacy and a legality problem from the Russian and the American point of view, because the Americans want to solve the problem. So meaning that if you sign something, guys, that should be signed, period. And therefore, we need to have the right guy on the negotiation table. And the right guy can only be decided if you have a presidential election. That's the rationale, and that's a reason why they want to have this a presidential election as part of the peace process. Now, the problem is that Trump definitely wants to stop that, because he considers the conflict as a black hole, and he doesn't want to spend more money on that. The problem is that the Europeans don't see the problem like this, and we have seen since last week, the reaction of the Europeans, especially the European Union with Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, the so-called Minister of exterior, I mean, the person in charge of the external service action of the European Union. And of course, from Great Britain with Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, mainly in France. And they started to oppose vehemently to the initiative of the Trump administration. And of course, the problem is that they want to have, in fact, they want to continue the war. And they try to find solutions, not an alternative to the proposal of Trump, but an alternative to the whole process of peace. In fact, they want to have this conflict continue. And that's where the thing starts to be weird, because even if UK and France are able to deploy 30,000 troops in Ukraine, we don't see exactly what would be the impact of this force. And we don't see clearly if this force would be able to reverse the trend of the battle. Meaning, since the beginning, we have a constant progress of Russian forces. There have been ups and downs, and it has been slowed down and acceleration sometimes, but by and large, we have a standing advance of Russian forces. How do we figure out 30,000 people will reverse that course of the war? We don't see that, and therefore I feel that the Europeans are currently missing an opportunity. They have missed the opportunity of finding, first of all, alternative to the war. I remind you that before the 24th of February 2022, France and Germany were the guarantors for Ukraine for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement. Had the Minsk Agreement been implemented, that means that the population of Donbass would have its right reestablished, its democratic right reestablished, and the war against them would have stopped. The whole thing would not have happened, because the purpose of the Russian intervention in 2022, its purpose was to protect the Russian population of Ukraine. There was no other objective as that. And so that's where we missed a first opportunity. And since then, the Europeans have systematically made every single mistake to avoid a solution for the conflict that would be advantageous for Ukraine, including, I remind you, I mean, we have just mentioned that before, what happened in March, early April 2022. So today, instead of finding a solution that could accommodate the reality of the battlefield, the reality on the ground, which is that Russia now occupies 4 oblasts or regions of Ukraine, and acknowledging that and building up something around this reality, the Europeans still have in mind that this reality is not a reality, in fact. You know, it's a little bit what Mark Rutte said, that Ukraine prevails, but the front line doesn't move in the right direction. You know, this is the kind of very strange type of reasoning. And that's where Trump has probably a more rational understanding of what's happening. And Of course, in the West, dealing with Russia is considered as rewarding the attackers. That's the whole thing. And I remember very well the Swiss ambassador to Kiev up to last year was a very good friend of mine. And when he left his position, he gave some interviews on the Swiss TV, and he said, "Well, if we make peace, that's being rewarding Russia for attacking Ukraine." It's a very strange view of things from a diplomat, because the diplomat, I mean, the idea here is not, and that's also not the role of a diplomat, to be a judge in a court. He's not here to say it was right, it was not, and things like this and that. The purpose is to try to solve the problem as it is, not as it would be, not as we expect it to be or what we perceive it to be, but to solve the problem as it is. And but that's very much what you hear now in Europe, that having some kind of agreement with Russia will be just rewarding Putin for attacking the Ukraine. And here, probably it's important to remind people. I don't know if I have time to show a brief presentation on the beginning, because a lot of people say Putin attacked because of NATO and all that. No, it's not true. The problem of NATO is an underlying problem, obviously, which is a concern for Russia, no doubt on that. And that's something that Russia will try to solve by leveraging the conflict in Ukraine. But that's not the reason why Putin decided the special military operation on the 24th of February 2022. And in order for people to understand, let me just go back in history and show you something, because I think it's important to understand. We have, and the starting point of all that is a decree that was issued by President Zelensky on the 24th of March 2021, where he established that he will reconquer, or in his words, in the political words, decolonize and reintegrate Crimea and Sevastopol. And if you read the text, you will see that it's not just Crimea and Sevastopol, but it's also all the southern part of the Ukraine, which include the Donbass. And from that point onwards, what you see is an increase of the shelling of Donbass. And here, this is a chart that was made by the International Crisis Group, which is, by the way, funded by partly by George Soros and also by the Swiss government, by the way. And you see perfectly that from end of March 2021, you had a critical increase of shelling of the Donbass. And that's just after this decree of the 24th of March was issued. And we are going towards February 2022, where you had a second massive increase of shelling. And these are the number of explosions that were recorded early 2022 by the observers of the OSCE. Just a small note here. I took these numbers from the OSCE reports, and I tried to put the figures of the explosions that were recorded in the Donbass, not the explosions that were made in the government-held territory, meaning that you had decisively an increase of the shelling of the Donbass. And that was interpreted by the Russians, and probably by others, because you may remember that on the 16th, I mean, before the 16th of February, Joe Biden said that he knew that Russia would attack on the 16th of February. And he knew that because he knew that that's the day where the Ukrainians would prepare for this offensive against the Donbass. And by the way, since March 2021, you had all this buildup in Ukraine. We have talked, a lot of people have talked about the buildup of Russian forces at the Ukrainian border, but that was a response to the buildup of Ukrainian forces on the borders of Donbass. And what you had then, and that's very important to understand then, probably it's a little bit small for the screen, but I can read for that. But basically, what you had between 2014 and 2022, you had 10,000 civilians dead in the Donbass. And we knew that, and we know that Ukraine refused to implement the Minsk agreement. 24th of March 2021, you have this executive order or decree to the reconquest of Crimea and Donbass, and you have end of March, the first intensification of the Donbass shelling, which is followed in February 22 by the second intensification of Donbass. And that rang the bell for the Russians to invoke the responsibility to protect. And that's exactly what the Russians have invoked, as they did in 28 in Georgia. Now, what is the responsibility to protect? Responsibility to protect is a principle of the United Nations, and it's based on three pillars. The first pillar is that every state has the responsibility to protect its own population. And that obviously didn't work because precisely you had the 10,000 killed in Donbass, which were essentially, I mean, that was fundamentally Ukrainians killed by the Kiev government. So the second pillar of the responsibility to protect is the responsibility of the wider international community to assist the state where you have the problem to protect their population. And that's where, in fact, where you had the Minsk agreements. And that failed also. Minsk 1 and then Minsk 2 were both violated by the government of Kiev. And you have the third pillar, which is the responsibility of the international community to take decisive action when the state is failing to protect its population. And we have to remember that this concept of responsibility to protect, and I know this because I used to be responsible for the policy and doctrine of the Department of Peacekeeping Operation to the UN, and one of my topics was obviously the protection of civilians. And this responsibility to protect has been designed after the failure of the international community to intervene in Rwanda in 1994. And therefore, there was this pillar 3 that allows the international community to intervene with decisive action to stop the violence. And that's exactly this pillar 3 that Russia is advocating and developing under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Now, how do we have this path to the Article 51? After the beginning, I think after what the Russians have identified as a possible start of operation, the 21st of February, Russia recognized the independence of the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. Why did they recognize them? So, because by recognizing their independence, it could then sign a treaty and friendship and cooperation and mutual assistance agreement with both of them. And that's what happened that very day on the 21st of February. On the 22nd of February 2022, those treaties of friendship and mutual assistance were ratified by the respective parliaments of the different country, the Duma for Russia and the parliaments of the DPR and the LPR. And so on the 23rd of February 2022, the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk could request military assistance to the Russia to intervene to help them. And that's exactly where the Article 51 of the UN Charter comes into the game. And that's exactly what happened, meaning that basically you have the legitimacy of the intervention that was given by the fact that the government of Kiev wanted to fight against its own population in the Donbass. And the legality was provided by the process that was established between Russia and the two republics in order to implement or to invoke the Article 51 of the UN Charter. And that led on the 24th of February 2022 to the start of the special military operation. Now, this is the process. And what Vladimir Putin said on that very day of the 24th of February was the aim of that, which was the two words he used as denazification and demilitarization of the threat against the population of Donbass. Now, no doubt that having a military success in Ukraine, Russia will now leverage this success to achieve a political success or strategic success, you could say, by having the, let's say, probably when it would be probably done in the framework of the security guarantees to Ukraine, to include Ukraine into a new security architecture for Europe. That's probably what the Russians will do. But the reason why they intervened was not to stop NATO. And if it were that, and many observers or commentators, even those who are pro-Russian, say that, but that would be illegal. Remember that Vladimir Putin is a lawyer. He understands the law perfectly. So he certainly didn't attack simply because of the expansion of NATO. Even if the expansion of NATO was probably a backgrounder for the whole problem. So that's for sure. But it's not the reason why this operation started exactly 3 years ago. And that's, I think it's important to say, because that also explains why Donald Trump just recently said or suggested that Ukraine started the conflict. A lot of people said, no, it's not true. Yes, he did say that. But he referred to that situation where Ukraine, in fact, created all the conditions to make Russia to intervene in Ukraine. And obviously, Ukraine didn't attack Russia, but it wanted to attack Russians. I mean, ethnic Russians. And Russia has always had a very high sense of responsibility to protect its former citizens, which are ethnic Russians, who were in fact abandoned after the dismantling of the Soviet Union. That's exactly what happened in Georgia. Exactly the same mechanism. And for that reason, the Russians have this sense of duty of protecting those citizens who are in a disadvantageous situation because they are minorities. Big or large minority, we can discuss that, but in any case, that's the whole that's the mindset, if you want, and that's the reason why Russia intervened. So if you just say it was just to stop NATO, no, that would be illegal. That would be illegal according to international law, even if you can consider this the principle of Astana, which is this idea that when considering your own security, you should take into account, you should not create a prejudice for the security of your neighbors. You cannot build up your security at the expense of others. And that, I think, is an important principle that was agreed upon by the OSCE members in the Declaration of Astana. I think it was 2010 or something like that. In any case, so that's the context. And that's the reason why Trump sees a legitimacy here in addressing the problem and in forcing Ukraine into a deal with Russia. That's explained. I think, again, we may agree or not with the logic that are developed here, but this is the way people see that, and it has its own logic. I mean, I'm not here to judge whether the decision to intervene in Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 was a good decision or not. But the process that led to that decision is the one I explained, and not the fantasies that we have heard so far that Putin wants to expand Russia or to recreate Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire, and wants what we hear today, because this kind of irrationality that we tried to explain, or we tried to explain Vladimir Putin's action as an irrational decision. And of course, today it feeds exactly what Emmanuel Macron just said a day ago or so, when he said that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will invade Europe. I mean, this is, we constructed a completely a fantasy around some fact that we refuse to accept. What I explained here with this timeline that I just showed is exactly what happened. And that's the logic that has been always explained by the Russians, but the West has consistently refused to accept. And I think the first step when you address a peace process is to accept the logic of these people. And to accept, I'm not saying that you should agree with that logic, but you should build your peace process around these logics. You cannot have peace out of the blue. You should understand what exactly led to the problem, the root causes of the problem. And in the peace process, you have to address those root causes. And my view is that obviously the Europeans have never understood that, because they didn't want to understand that. Because understanding that would mean they didn't do their job. And that applies especially for France and Germany, who had the ability to stop the whole thing even before it started. But they never did that. I mean, if it was a Nuremberg tribunal or a trial on that, I would certainly put the François Hollande, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, and Scholz in the box of those who were accused, because they made every effort to make this war happening. I mean, and that's consistent. I mean, we can see that. Anyway, so that, I think, is what we can say from this process, what we are seeing unfolding today, is that Trump has understood that. He understands that if we want to have a solution, we should give up with all the narrative we had. We should start from a white page and start again and have people on the table and discussing. And that's I think what I can say about what we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks and so. But again, what I have said also, I think, last week, what is surprising is the inability of the European leadership And when I say European leadership, I took the European leadership at two levels: the level of the European Union, but also at the level of the individual countries, especially those large countries like Germany, Switzerland, sorry, not Switzerland precisely, France, Italy, and UK, who are those countries who have the ability and the power to political power, I mean, to stop that. But none of them, of the leaders, have understood or tried to understood what was at stake really for the Russians and probably for the Ukrainians as well. I mean, Ukraine started provocation, which because it was a provocation on from mid-February 2022 onwards. That the provocation had as a backgrounder this idea of being part of NATO. And the strange thing in all that, and that's where probably only psychiatrists or psychologists could explain that, but apparently it was clear, and because Volodymyr Zelensky himself told that in March 2022. I don't know if I have here the quote that he made in March to CNN, where I think it's that. Yes, that's his quote. He said, "I requested them, I mean, that was the Americans, personally, to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in the years of two." And the response was no, you will not be member of NATO, but publicly the doors will be open. Meaning that, and that was on the 21st of March 2022 by CNN, meaning that the whole question that comes and again, and everybody is repeating, and Zelensky is asking for being part of NATO. He knows from the very start of the whole crisis that that will not be the case. And the only way of having and that's probably the only reason why he stick to that, because Jens Stoltenberg, and that was in May last year, he said, the only way for Ukraine to enter NATO is to prevail over Russia. And we know that is not possible. So the whole thing is constructed on perception, not even perception, fantasies. Because, and I think what Jens Stoltenberg said is in essence correct. There is no way Ukraine, being in conflict with Russia, could enter NATO without solving the conflict. And therefore, it should prevail over Russia. And that's probably, and that's the fundamental idea behind the whole thing. The problem is that we know since 2022, in fact, since June 2022, at the point where the Russia defeated, I would say, the first Ukrainian army, because in early June 2022, Zelensky said, from this point onwards, we depend on the help from the Westerners, meaning that the military resources of Ukraine were destroyed at this point, and he had to rely on the military support from the West. And later we had exactly the same thing in later the same year. And then after the so-called counteroffensive of summer 2023, we had exactly the same thing. So since, in fact, end of 2022, early 2023, we know that defeating or prevailing over Russia will not be possible. So, but Zelensky still comes and comes again and again with this idea that he should be member of NATO. So we are here in something which is surrealistic in some way, because he should have stopped that earlier, understanding that it was not possible to defeat Russia. Having an agreement in April 2022 with the Russians, he should have stopped that. But again, who made him continue the war? That were the British. Boris Johnson is a guy who, like Lindsey Graham and Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, they make the war with the blood of the Ukrainians. Doesn't cost much for them. It's not even their money that they're spending. It's not the life of their own boys that they're spending. They make the war with the blood of the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians are defeated, it's because of these guys. For no other reason, because we know that the outcome of the conflict is somehow already on the table. We know what's happening today, and if you read my book Operation Z that was published in fall 2022, the whole process is described. So we know that. We know that it would happen that way. So we have deliberately sent Ukraine into a trap somehow, simply for the sake of fighting Vladimir Putin, because all these people that I have mentioned hate, for a reason or another, Vladimir Putin. That's it.
Colonel, it seems to me that we had Duda, the president of the Polish president, trying to talk with Donald Trump for more than an hour, but it didn't take that much time. It was few minutes. That it shows that the result shows that how divided are the United States and Europeans right now in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron doing the same way, Stormer the same way. How, when you look at these leaders, you talk about Angela Merkel together with François Hollande, they were guarantors of the Minsk I and Minsk II at least in 2015. But the new generation of European leaders are not better than what it was before, and they're doing the same, even worse. Right now, they have the opportunity to put an end to the conflict, but they don't seem to care about what's going on. And as you mentioned, Ukrainians are getting killed. Ukrainians are losing. Even with the process of what Donald Trump is putting on the table, Ukrainians are losing even more. But it doesn't seem that these leaders in Europe would care about anything, any reality of what's going on.
I think the problem is that these guys, first of all, I'm not sure these persons, you talk about Emmanuel Macron, we could talk about Annalena Baerbock, all these guys. Annalena Baerbock used to be a champion of Trampolino. So, I'm not sure this person were she used to be a militant of the Green Party for a nice environment, against climate change and all that. And I can understand this kind of concern, but these are not people who are prepared to manage large countries with huge strategic and geopolitical issues at stake. They're not prepared for that. They're not ready for that. And and the problem is that since the beginning of the conflict, and I would say even before the conflict, in fact, they were caught in a kind of rhetoric that Vladimir Putin is the enemy, as Trump used to be, and starts to be again the enemy. This is this kind of ideological, dogmatic understanding of the world. The During the Cold War, as I said, I am a Cold War warrior. We never personalized the conflict. When we made an assessment on the situation, it was not about Brezhnev or Andropov or whoever. It was about a system. And we were so confident that we were on the right track that we didn't even need to have censorship. What J.D. Vance said. I think what J.D. Vance said about the freedom of speech and all that, in fact, reflects the nature of a leadership which is extremely insecure in Europe, especially. In the Cold War, you could buy the Pravda, which used to be the paper, which is the official paper of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You could buy it in almost any paper or newspaper outlet in the West, in Paris, in Geneva, and you had, if you wanted the Russian Pravda, it was there. It was not censored. Literaturная газета. You had probably not Krasnaya Zvezda, which was a military papers, but the political papers, you could access them without any problem. And nobody tried to censor them. The Russians or the Soviets at the time had a censorship in their country, but we had absolutely non-censorship for their papers because we were confident that we were on the right path. And we had this kind of Darwinist approach of the information, that you don't need to prevent people from speaking. But you would say the best information will just be, it will how say that, it will surpass the bad information. It's a natural selection of information. That's how it worked. You had no censorship, even if we were in the Cold War. Even if we had those units stationed in Germany and facing each other with this iron curtain and minefields in between the East and West Germany and all that, and you had those forces which were in turn in some other degree. So we were almost in a permanent war situation, but nevertheless, we never needed to have a censorship, because we didn't need that. We were simply better. That's it. Today, the problem is that I'm not sure that our elites are so confident of what they say. They have some kind of political postures. They have a kind of a narrative. But a narrative is something constructed, It's not the reality. And as we have seen in the past 3 years and even before, and that applies equally to the Palestinian conflict, the conflict with China, that applies to many other conflicts or crises we had. We built up a narrative in order to make ourselves confident that we are on the right path. We didn't need a narrative during the Cold War. There was no narrative. We didn't need that. And that, I think, is a symptom of the reality that we have in Europe. In most countries in Europe, I see that in Belgium, I see that in Switzerland, I see that in France too. Political parties have problems recruiting candidates. There are not so many people who are willing to make a career in politics. Because in Europe, first of all, it's probably when you earn much less than being in politics in the US, for instance. I'm not saying that the politicians are well paid, but they can have compensation by being part of of becoming entering in the a board of some company and things like this, just by being politicians. This does exist in Europe as well, but it's not as, let's say, rewarding that it could be in other countries. And the problem is that when you are politicians in Europe, you expose yourself to caricatures and to be to come in the media and all that, on the social networks and things like this, without having some much financial reward for that. You know, nobody knows who is the head of Nestle, the Swiss concern, the company for food and chemicals. Nobody knows him, but he earns several millions a day, you know, and nobody talks about him. You don't see him in the media. You don't see him nowhere. Nobody is making caricature about him and all that. So here you have to see what is the benefit of being into the political system. And that's I'm making things a little bit like a caricature, but this is the essence of the problem. I have been asked many times in Switzerland to be part of political parties, and I always refuse because I'm not interested in that. But the thing is that political parties have problems recruiting. As a result, since they don't get the best ones, they take what they can take. And it's exactly what you find and you find that everywhere. I mean, all the people of my generation remember those politicians that we had in the 60s and the 70s in Europe that made, in fact, Europe, and made the countries they could they were managing these countries into probably the best decades after a Second World War. These guys were seasoned politicians. They had professional experience. They were older, but they had experience. They had contacts. They had networks, and not just Twitter and things like this. It was deeper relationship with each other. They were not afraid talking to each other. They were not afraid saying no to each other. And these people had personalities. And today, if you compare the politicians we had even 30 years ago with those we have today, it's a huge difference. And today you have people that we tried to get. I mean, I mentioned a couple of times Ursula von der Leyen and Annalena Baerbock and all that. And I have been both in the UN and in NATO. I have been the originator of several directives to better include women into a decision process for peacekeeping and peace operations and all that. But I insisted on that. It's good to have women and to be inclusive in decision making, because you don't want to forget about existing competences. But the inclusiveness must not be an objective in itself. You don't want, as Minister XYZ, a woman just because you need to have a woman, because you need to have 50% women. You need to have someone who is competent for the task, who is up to the task. That's the main criteria. And if it's a woman, fine, perfectly fine. But it has to be the best one, the one who can bring the subject further and not backwards. And when we have mentioned several times on your channel, Liz Truss, Ursula von der Leyen, Annalena Baerbock. I mean, there are so many, and I'm not even counting the French politicians, because then it's a real clown world. Uh, all these persons, you see that they are not even intellectually up to the task. They don't have the personality of that, but they don't have the intellectual capabilities to do the job. But they are there because we need them. I mean, Kaya Kallas. If you think about the rationality of having Kaya Kallas as responsible for the External Action Service of the European Union, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Ministry of the European Union, what has she demonstrated? Nothing. She used to be prime minister of one of the smallest country of Europe, which is Estonia, which has 1.5 million inhabitants or something like that, which, by the way, is a country that has not been able to manage its own Russian minority, so that this minority has not even been granted the Estonian citizenship just because they are Russian, because they were born there before the independence. They don't speak Estonian, and therefore they are not granted the citizenship. Therefore, they are non-citizens. Non-citizens. The European Union had to make a passport especially for this kind of non-citizens in the Baltic states. And this person who hates Russia, I mean, this is the driver of her action. This is the hate of Russia. She's now coming from the smallest country, one of the smallest country of Europe, and she's managing the foreign policy of the European Union. This doesn't make any sense at all. At all. But that was, and that is probably the explanation why we have this discrepancy between, obviously, Donald Trump, which is from the older generation, and a guy like Emmanuel Macron, who is obviously from a completely different generation. And Trump, again, is not a pacifist, and okay, the American people has selected him, and that we have to accept and to respect that decision. Whether Trump is good for the world, it's a totally different question. But the American people have selected Trump not for the world, but for United States, which makes a lot of sense, you know. And Trump, therefore, acts in the interest of the United States. And since trying to work for the interest of others conflicts with the interest of the United States, it's normal that it works. This is simply logic. What you can't understand is how come European leaders are working against the interest of their own population. And that's where you need to have the question. How come these people can start, and again, I come back to Annalena Baerbock. She said, I don't have the exact wording now, but she said, in essence, I don't care what the German people think. I'm doing my policy, and that's it. I don't care what they think and what they want. It's not my problem. I'm in that position. I'm doing what I think is right for Germany. And I'm not sure that's the essence of politics, especially in a democracy. In a dictatorial state, that's probably a reasoning that you can justify, but not in a democracy. But that explains very much the whole thing. And this is an evolution that, in my view, with the distance, is totally new in Europe. And I am deploring that because I think it doesn't help to improve things. And we have Macron today. He's taking decisions that are even against his own country, and not even against France. It's even against Ukraine. Because the reason behind this reluctance of European leaders to come along with the Trump administration is simply because they want to fight Putin. So it's not even in order to help the Ukrainian population or to make them suffer less, because otherwise they would have acted before, but they never did that. No, the whole thing is to weaken, to have a regime change in Russia. So what is the interest? And that's where the Trump administration comes with very interesting features, because when Marco Rubio, when he was interviewed by Megyn Kelly on CBS, I think, he said, well, we are acting according to United States national interest. Russia acts in according its own national interest, and China also. They all have their national interests and work towards fulfilling these national interests. We are doing the same. And that's, I think it's a very interesting comment. It seems obvious, but that's, in the last 3 years, I think that's the first time that a political leader says that we are working for our national interest. Before, nobody did that. They did that in the name of principles, of ideas and whatever, but not as a function of the national interest. And that explains the result of the elections in Germany, probably in other parts of Europe as well, where you have people where you see that the gap between the population and the leadership is widening everywhere, because people understand that they have leaders who act simply according to their ideas, not according to interests of the population. In fact, they are even degrading the situation of their own population in order to fulfill their own fantasies. And that's not the definition of democracy. Democracy is the power of the people, meaning that the one who has been elected or selected by the population has to represent the interest of the people, because we cannot have countries led by 50 million people. So it has to be one who represents them, but he represents them. He doesn't represent himself. I think that's very important. And that's certainly something that Emmanuel Macron has not understood. He feels that he's elected, and for him, he received kind of a blank check from the French population. People have elected him not to fulfill the aspiration of the French people. He is the aspiration of the French people. This is almost we are very close to this situation where you feel that you are just sent by God as a messiah for the population. It's not far away from that. It has not this religious aspect, but it's exactly the same kind of principle. I'm not here to fulfill the interest of the population, but the population admires me and I can fulfill my own aspiration. And that's exactly what 60 million people will accept. It's it's putting the things upside down, you know. And that's exactly what we hear when we talk about Ukraine. Nobody talks about the interest of Ukrainians. Nobody. Literally nobody. We even sent weapons that were not working. I remember those Leopard 1A5 that were returned by the Ukrainians to the Dutch and to the Danes, but I think the Dutch in any case. They returned tanks because they said they were not working. Please send us tanks that work. So that means that there was absolutely no interest in helping the Ukrainians. These politicians that needed to have the image of helping Ukraine, to be shown helping Ukraine, is more important than helping Ukraine. And the best way to help Ukraine would have been from the French leaderships, because that comes back to François Hollande and his government, and later with Emmanuel Macron. The best way to help Ukraine would have been to avoid the conflict, to listen to the Russians, to implement the Minsk agreement. That would have been the best way to help the Ukrainians. But in order to avoid this discussion, nobody, when you look at the media, for instance, when they refer to the Donbas republics, I'm talking about what happened before the conflict, so before 3 years ago, they always talked about separatists. But in fact, if you read the Minsk agreement, which was exactly what Russia advocated, in the Minsk agreement, the Minsk agreement was not about to separate the republics from Ukraine. On the contrary, it was to integrate them, but to give them some degree of autonomy for language, schooling, and things like this. So they were best described as autonomists. But if you say so, then you're just putting the finger on the mistake of the European leadership. Therefore, we use separatists, so that there is a reason to deny the implementation of the Minsk agreement, because they were separatists. But in fact, nobody read these agreements, by the way. But if you read them, you will see it's about the autonomy. And not even the autonomy of the Republic of Lugansk, but the autonomy of certain region within the Oblast of Lugansk and Donetsk. Certain region in the Oblast of Lugansk and Donetsk. So, meaning these agreements, especially Minsk II, because it's eventually the one that remained, this was definitely in favor of Ukraine. The problem is, and nobody wants to acknowledge that either, is that those who went into power in 2014 were right-wing extremists. And what they were aiming at was to have a Ukraine pure, with a pure race. That reminds the wording of some others mustache people. But that was the idea. And that's the reason why, when people say, and I read that in a report from the Swiss intelligence service, by the way, that was published recently, and they said Vladimir Putin doesn't even recognize Ukraine as a country. That's totally wrong. That's based on an article that was published by Vladimir Putin on the 12th of July 2021, where he says that there is no reason to make a difference between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians in 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 Ukraine. That was interpreted in the West as saying, "Well, all Ukraine is Russian." But that's exactly the opposite that Putin was saying, "Well, we have a common history. That's all." And why did he write this article? Nobody tells that. He wrote this article because on the 1st of July 2021, the Ukrainian Rada adopted a law that make a difference between the ethnic Russians and and here I can probably find, and that's interesting probably to show to the oh no, I have it in French. Sorry about that. I have it only in French. Sorry, so it's no need to do that. But they adopted a law that makes a difference between ethnicities, and the Russians basically do not enjoy the same rights as the other ethnic Ukrainians based on ethnicity. And I can probably read that. I will translate directly, but I can show the text, and probably those who can read French can read. I will translate that. I will show that. But that was one of the deputies of the Verkhovna Rada. He said, Russians are not autochthonous people in the sense of the law, and they will not enjoy fully all the human rights and all fundamental liberties or freedoms established by international law and which are written in the constitution and laws of Ukraine. And that was in the press. So I'm not inventing that. That was in the Russian media. So meaning that, of course, we created that narrative that that Putin simply wanted to take over Ukraine. But there were fundamental reasons for the Ukrainians to fight against the Russians, and Russians, not just Vladimir Putin, by the way. That's the reason why, even if a lot of people in Russia are probably not so enthusiastic about war as such, but they still follow Vladimir Putin, because I think the common ground of all the Russians is the compassion they have for those ethnic Russians which are in other countries and considered as minority and not enjoying all the rights they should enjoy. And that's the reason why, for the Russians, this war is a just war. And I think it's very important to understand all these aspects that none of our media has reflected, because precisely reflecting that would precisely give legitimacy and a rationale to this military operation that started exactly 3 years ago.
Colonel, thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.